celebrating our 400th episode, the Almost Daily Zencast presents special segment.
Good morning, Trumptopia. A special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast. Hosted by the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's talk Trump.
Hello and namaste. Welcome to the Almost Daily Zencast's special segment, Good Morning Trumptopia, hosted by your favorite incorrigible host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Thank you for tuning in, especially any new members of the audience fam. Welcome to the show. Strap yourselves in, because there's a lot to get through. Today is a special day, friends. You are now currently listening to the 400th episode of the Almost Daily Zencast. I started this podcast as a hobby, a purely amateur exercise in exploring the idea of a talk show style podcast discussing current events, societal trends, politics, and how all these things intersect with authentic spirituality. If you're new to the show, you might be like, what the fuck does he mean by authentic spirituality? How is politics and spirituality intersecting? Hang tight. It all gets explained. For anybody that's new, and we have been seeing some really exciting growth lately, friends, thank you for those of you who've been sharing the show with your neighbors and family members, etc. Much appreciated. And welcome to any and all new listeners, regardless of how you discovered the show. It is January 14th, 8:46 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. 2021 is the year of our Lord, as they used to say. And if there's anything that 2020 made perfectly clear to this guy, it's this. My suspicion that Donald J. Trump is categorically not some prophesied savior, not St. Bernard disguised as Trump. Done. I do not understand, I cannot comprehend how after everything that's happened, self-declared, quote, Christians are clinging to Trump as some sort of prophesied anointed savior. If that were true, he would be personally healing everyone who's sick with COVID and any other disease. Because that's what golden motherfucking enlightened bastards do. They don't run around manipulating the American population into judging their fellow Americans over how to be an American. I lived through that late 80s, early 90s WWJD craze, and what amazes me is that the people proclaiming Trump to be some sort of divine anointed soldier for Jesus do not stop to ask themselves, what would Jesus actually do in this situation? Call me crazy, but I do not think that the actual Yeshua Christos would pit people against their neighbors using political ideology. That alone disqualifies Donald John Trump, in my humble opinion, as some kind of anointed savior type. And yet here we are. The Capitol building was invaded by people who believed themselves to be acting in the name of Trump, sanctioned somehow by the Lord Almighty himself. For those of you that are very new to the show, let me be clear about my opinion about Donald Trump. For those of you who've heard me express this before, I apologize for sounding like a broken record. I do not hate the guy. First things first. I refuse to deal with hate. Hate is an ego trap set forth by ego, which of course is the nefarious spiritual force behind mundane, pedantic human corruption. Trump promised his base a revolution. Did he deliver? The base, those who remain hardcore blind faith believers in the base, they seem to have talked themselves into believing that January 6th was somehow some sort of massive win. But that's par for the course with Donald Trump. Win, win, win everywhere, all the winning. From Trump Steaks to Trump University to 100 miles of repaired fencing and 9 miles of new fencing, none of which was paid for by Mexico. Every promise Trump has made to his base has been a two-faced, manipulative, misleading, tactical lie, wrapped up with the little nuggets of truth and the patina of believability. Trump has successfully manipulated a portion of the American electorate into believing that the only solution to their grievance is violence against their fellow Americans. This coming from the demographic of Americans who insist on calling this country a, quote, Christian nation. The hypocrisy is mind-numbing. For clarity, though, I am a two wings, one bird kind of motherfucker. I am in no way, shape, or form a blind faith defender of all things to the left of Trump. For those of you who have not heard me clarify this before, let me put it really simply. Politics is a distraction from meaningful civic action. Let's zoom back out from the immediate situation, right? And it is an urgent, critical, emergency status situation. There's no minimizing what Trump has been doing since ascending into power. Despite all the efforts of his defenders in Congress, which I'll talk about. I listened to a good majority of the debate yesterday as the House voted to impeach Donald Trump for a second time. Big league. We've made it big league now, friends. But first, as is the new prerogative, no, the new creative, whatever I'm trying to say, let's take a moment to cleanse the palate and transition. a bit of music from my charismatic yet completely stoic and silent sidekick, DJ Zed, and his forthcoming imaginary album, End Times, Late Night Retroism, a retro wave remix live digital music track for your listening pleasure. Well, folks, Washington, D.C. has battened down the hatches and deployed military defenses. According to one report that I caught this morning, there are now 3 times as many troops deployed in Washington, D.C. as there are in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan combined. Now, I think that refers strictly to, what are they called? Oh, I just had their name at the tip of my tongue. Not the Rangers, not the MPs. Anyways, National Guard, that's the phrase. Forgive me, I'm a little space cadet-y sometimes. So there are now 3 times more National Guard units or members deployed to Washington, D.C. than there are in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan combined. Now, part of that is probably because we very weirdly withdrew lots of troops from the Middle East under Donald Trump, which is one of the things that the base exaggerates into this borderline false claim that Trump has ended all the wars. Just another example of what a nonsensical liar this guy is, okay? So, listening to the debate yesterday in the House, as you probably already heard, ultimately, they voted to impeach. 10 Republicans crossed the aisle, making it the most bipartisan impeachment in American history. Of course, Donald Trump is only the 3rd president, I believe, to be officially impeached, and the very first president to get impeached twice in one term. So here's my broad stroke critique of the debate yesterday. Both sides relied on a repetitive, unimaginative, and not really well spelled out arguments. The right, those of whom continued to defend Trump, just sounded like a broken record Trump sycophant, twisting and making false comparisons and dismissing all the critical information that is there in the evidence, and only choosing to address the issues that they can turn into some sort of accusation of hypocrisy to the left. There was a lot of woe is meing. There was a lot of sad apologistic defense of Trump. He's the most hated president in history. The irony and problem I have with that statement is that most of the politicians making that kind of claim, and a great plurality of the Republican base repeating and regurgitating that talking point, are the same people that spent 8 years spewing mindless, disgusting, and often racially charged hate speech at Obama. Not even bothering to get at him for his flaws in politics. Never mind policy discussions. They just spewed hate, which was stupidly obvious in its racist motivation and undeniable in its disgusting level of blind rage. And it was in that context that Donald Trump launched his, for the umpteenth time, mind you, because it's not the first time he got to try to get into politics, but he launched his political career with the very manipulative and misleading false claim of the birtherism theory. And then he has spent every minute of every day since the 2020 election spinning misleading, untrue, manipulative statements mixed in with a lot of interesting half-truths and whole truths. As I've said from the beginning, I warned anyone considering themselves an anti-Trump coalition member not to fall for the ego trap of just blindly hating him and assuming that he's stupid. He's playing a part. He's playing a role that he thinks has always worked for him. The reason I couldn't jump on the Trump train, despite agreeing with some of the general concerns that he uses to whip his base into, a frenzy, boils down to the simple fact that his entire professional history before announcing leads to if looked at with clarity and without a pro-Trump blind faith bias, a discerning, critical thinking individual will very likely come to the conclusion that he is at best a corrupt billionaire that kind of doesn't know what he's doing, and at worst, a cunning but still somewhat ridiculous and easily self-undermining. Like, he just destroys his own momentum. But he's a con man, right? Ask anybody that paid him hard money to study at Trump University. That alone should have disqualified him from running, but it magically didn't. The grab him by the pussy tape didn't. Nothing stopped his momentum. It was almost as if, in my humble opinion, from back in the day and now with hindsight, it feels almost as if whatever it is that we call the system wanted him there. Now, why would the system want a rebel in the White House? I think we've come to see why. The system, theoretically speaking, right? For I never pretend to know things that I do not know. So I will always try to be clear. if I'm speculating. I'm speculating now. And there's a lot of things about my perspective that people from all sides might find a little bit confusing at first, right? Conspiracy theorists immediately dismiss me because I don't buy into their favorite conspiracy theories, despite the fact that I've been judgmentally observing conspiracy theory content for over 30 years. They don't want to hear my opinion about any conspiracy theory content because I can't agree with them blindly from the get-go. Therefore, my opinion can't be valid. And simultaneously, I also sort of tend to alarm those that are generally on the opposite end of the spectrum that are anti-conspiracy theory, because I recognize that there are indeed ingredients, elements, and aspects of some conspiracy theory content that is indeed very true. And the key to understanding my perspective is grappling with the following statement. Nothing and no one is as absolutely good or evil as their opposition would want you to believe, or as they would want you to think about themselves. No one is as good as they might claim to be. And that means no, I don't think anybody is as good as they might pretend to be. Even the best of the best people have got flaws. And even the worst of the worst people are, in my humble opinion, redeemable. Because nothing is absolute. And yet, isn't it a fascinating coinkydink pattern that almost all conspiracy theory content dictates absolute statements about that which you must fear, loathe, and hate? Things that make you go, Trump is one of those people that thinks that way. Whether he has long been a conspiracy theory enthusiast or he's only recently found it a useful tool, he's always been the kind of mind that thinks in the patterns and modalities for which conspiracy theory content is sort of designed. Blind faith, absolute loyalty, the complete and total rejectionary judgment of all those that cannot preeminently agree. Right? If you can't agree with my conspiracy theory collection, then you're not valid. It doesn't matter which conspiracy theories you subscribe to. They all sneak in that kind of psychologically manipulative directives in there. So, the flaws in the debate. The left just kept blaming conspiracy theory content and Trump for inciting the march, without going into any further detail or harnessing the wealth of evidence in the contextual history of Trump and his public declarations, giving the defendants, the apologists defending Trump, plenty of room to argue that there was no way Trump's singular speech on that day could have incited the following events. The Trump supporters constantly kept returning to the meaningless talking point that the first impeachment failed to prove anything. That's the most persistent misrepresentation of the outcomes of the first impeachment trial imaginable. I mean, it's what Bill Barr did, right? By preemptively summarizing, quote unquote, the report, he established a set of falsehoods that continue to be peddled today, especially by people who never bothered to read the Mueller report. Plenty of evidence of criminal behavior was exposed and reported on. Go read the report. It's laid out quite clearly. What they could not find was enough evidence to transcend or ignore the DOJ memo, which says, generally speaking, we're not going to take action on a sitting president. The second big lie about the first impeachment that was perpetuated through insinuation and direct statement in the debate yesterday was that he was and Trump used this word when the Mueller report first came out, totally vindicated. Nonsense. He was not totally vindicated. And while the first impeachment could not render a conviction, that had less to do with any failure or flaw in the argument and more to do with the fact that Mitch McConnell would not allow Republicans in the Senate to vote their conscience. Apparently, according to some reporting over the last 48 hours, he has no such prohibition this time. He's playing it really close to the vest, Moscow Mitch, which is quite fascinating. But ultimately, my dear friends and listeners, my concern is this. The Trump base simultaneously is applauding their behavior on the 6th and trying to excuse it all by blaming Antifa, which is adorable because while I've said this before and I'll say it again, there's no doubt that there were people mixed into the crowd that weren't necessarily exclusively MAGA. That will probably always be the case. But there's no evidence. And the one company that was attributed to saying that they had identified Antifa individuals is threatening to sue the paper. I think it was the Washington Post, but don't quote me on that. I might be wrong. Whichever paper initially published the article saying such and such company has claimed to identify Antifa members in the crowd, that company is suing that paper. That paper had to retract the story, although they did not publish an apology, because the company was like, the fuck are you saying? We didn't make such claims. So that's a fun detail. And then, of course, as a follow-up, several of the individuals that were accused of being Antifa by the Trump base self-identified as MAGA in their arrest procedures. Now, there's already been there's been a growing number of arrests, and there's a growing body of new evidence and new information coming out. For instance, the most fascinating and interesting bit that's come out, in my opinion, is that there is indeed elements of this all being an inside job, quote unquote, but not in the way that the conspiracy theory deniers might want you to think, which is fascinating. Within 36 hours of the Capitol building being breached, members of the Trump base that weren't there were already dismissing it as a black flag, false flag. It was I was talking on the show earlier, and I still don't know if this person's comment was like sarcastic or very, very sincere. But someone posted on my Facebook, don't you know this is all fake and it was filmed on that film studio on the moon, which doesn't make sense because there's a conspiracy theory that the moon is fake and that was filmed in a film studio. So anyways, there's already denials, right? And so that mythology will live on. And this event, from what I can gather right now, contextually, from various reports and comments from people in social media that self-identify as MAGA, this event will simultaneously be denied as a hoax created by the left to try to damage Trump, but will also be heralded as one of the greatest wins in MAGA history, especially if they get away with more. According to reports and an FBI bulletin, there have been and are growing number of discussions on the internet, right? That can be found indicating aspirational plans for future actions in defense of Trump to try to, quote, stop the steal, which explains why, despite the fact that they were woefully unprepared on the 6th, there are now so many troops deployed in Washington, D.C. At first, I thought this is the echo chamber creating plausible deniability and a schism within itself, right? And because that always happens. That ultimately, an echo chamber will develop divergent frequencies and split apart and become two different echo chambers. That's why we're always discussing these theoretical cold civil wars, politically speaking. The other bit of interesting news that's broken in the last 36 hours comes from I think she's a freshman, and I totally don't have her name in front of me because I suck and I'm not a journalist. I'm just a guy with an opinion. But you can find her. I'm sure she will get a lot more coverage in the coming days. But she's, forgive me for not remembering her name, she's calling for an investigation into a series of events the day before. Apparently, large groups of visitors, quote unquote, were seen being given tours of the Capitol building by staffers and congresspersons on January 5th. Now, that can get dismissed as innocent enough on the surface of it, until one is reminded that since the beginning of the COVID lockdown, there has been no public touring of the Capitol building. So what the bloody fuck were these people doing taking a tour the day before this event? And according to this congresswoman's statements, from the best of my recollection, she is concerned that these visitors were in fact participants in the rally and march and raid the following day. Apparently, investigations are already underway in this regard. One thing is sure, dear friends and listeners, January 6th will be as investigated as Benghazi was by the right, I think. It would be a ridiculous thing for the left to not investigate the living shit out of this situation. But I digress. I want to connect one more dot. One of the most interesting things I've seen coming out of the MAGA base since January 6th is this unsourced, unverified claim that the Insurrection Act has been activated by Donald Trump. I don't think he's done it. I have no proof but neither do they, right? Like, I've seen this claim multiple times now. It's a broad, generic statement trying to rationalize why Trump immediately disavowed the events of January 6th while simultaneously praising the people who did it. That's a fascinating thing in and of itself. But the time has come, friends, for us to once more cleanse the palate for one hot second and let DJ Zed spin some groove pad digital music magic for you from the album entitled Next. Here is Too Much Funk, Is There Such a Thing? A Funk Messenger groove pad digital music track for your listening pleasure. It's a sad thing, my friends, to see the fuck your feelings crowd get so tragically butthurt over their spray-tanned con artist puppet losing the election. So butthurt that they're willing to perpetuate the obviously debunked lie that the election was stolen. Mind you, I am not a blind faith believer of leftist politics any more than I can be accused of being a blind faith believer of rightist politics. But it's clear to me that the one thing I've warned both sides about is building in critical mass and about to blow up in all of our faces unless we do something about it and help the nation simmer the fuck down. I've been accused of being anti-gun. I'm not anti-gun. I'm anti-violence profiteering. The system, theoretically speaking, if we're going to define, in theory, a system of oppression, I'm going to insist that included in the definition is this statement. The system profiteers on conflict and violence. The system wants you, whoever the fuck you are, to choose violence. The system wants American on American violence in the streets of America. Now, I'm not accusing Donald Trump of wanting that. Although, who knows? He probably thinks it's a good idea. He did seem to enjoy watching his base attack the Capitol building. I don't know. I wasn't there. But to have been a fly on Mike Pence's head that day. Well, actually, no. Who would have been in the White House with Donald Trump? To be a fly on Ivanka Trump's head on that day would have been fascinating. But here we are facing a critical transition of power, right? When Donald Trump entered the scene, I proposed to the audience listening to my humble amateur show that, theoretically speaking, I perceive Donald Trump as a complicit participant in a pendulum stress test of the American Republic. It seems pretty clear after 30 years of observing political trends that the way things are operated, the way this duopoly functions, the way these political echo chambers work, seems to involve this back and forth, this pendulum swing from extreme left to extreme right. Now, most Americans actually find themselves somewhere in the middle, really. Most Americans want the same basic things. Most human beings want the same basic things. What's his name's hierarchy of needs, right? It's not Pavlov. Maslow? Forget his name. That scientist guy's hierarchy of needs. We all have that in common. Does politics actually fucking help us in that regard? In my humble opinion, no, it does not. It fills us full of nonsense about how someone's going to fight for us on the issues that impact our fundamental hierarchy of needs. But a critical survey in recent American history will show you that politics categorically fails at solving the problems that politics creates, which impact our hierarchy of needs. One perfect, simple example. Today, as I was getting ready to go on the air, the news was breaking, and somebody from the state was going to talk about how the governor, or was it the mayor? I didn't write any notes down. I just sort of, it was on the air as I was getting ready and about to turn off the TV. But the Flint, Michigan issue. When was that? When did that happen? When did we discover that Flint, Michigan had already been suffering for years with toxic shit in their water? 2014, if I remember correctly. Today, we got news that the local politician responsible for that whole clusterfuck of toxic fail is finally going to confront some legal consequences. Are we even sure that the pipes have been fully fixed yet? I've heard some news, some claims that third parties, non-governmental individuals rallied the money together and someone's replacing the pipes. But even if they're all drinking pristine, crystal clear water now, the fact that it took that long, that many people got sick, that the politicians responsible have not faced any consequences as of yet, that's what politics does. And that's just a surface effect, in my opinion. There's a deeper agenda going on, my dear friends. A deeper agenda involving your very soul. But I'm not one of those religious weirdos that's peddling a fatalistic prophecy in order to get you to belong to my church. I haven't even started a church yet, although I've always been tempted. But that's a subject for another day. Put a pin in that on the giant imaginary corkboard of things we've got to come back to and talk about. In terms of the immediate situation at a national level, obviously we need calmer minds and more peaceful hearts to prevail right now, dear friends. This isn't about left versus right. This is about ideology versus reality. The reality is we are all humans. We all have the same needs. We all share common flaws. And we are all susceptible to corruption. And we all need spiritual healing. Now, occasionally we hear talk about moral values and the soul of America and general banter about healing the nation. But when was the last time politicians actually invested in the spiritual work required to facilitate the deep healing we need as a people? And I'm not talking about this religion, that religion. I mean the fundamentals of spiritual healing work, which transcend all religions. Put a pin on the issue of organized religion, folks, because I've talked about it before on the show. And if you're new, I humbly invite you to dig around this massive pile of content. Do not be dissuaded by some of the episode titles, for every episode spirals out from the immediate context of what just happened to the broader context of my worldview and my concerns, which is why I do this show. I'm not here to preach anything to nobody. I'm not here to convince you to blind faith believe in me instead of that person or the other one. I'm here to share with you my thoughts, questions, concerns, and my theoretical understanding of what I think is going on, so that you, dear friends and listeners, may humbly, critically, and genuinely question it, think about it for yourself, and so that we can have a discussion, right? Politics created the situation that we're in now. No matter how you slice it, no matter which party you prefer, everybody involved in politics is complicit in creating this context we are sitting through now. Creating this American versus American mental attitude, this ideological landscape that is driving a wedge through the fabric of this republic, of this community of communities. As I like to remind folks, Trump said he alone can fix it, and all he did was make it worse. He didn't drain the swamp, he just lightly remodeled it so that it fits into his whole Trumptopian theme. He didn't drain the swamp, he didn't eliminate the swamp monsters, he restocked it with his own preferred breed of political monstrosities. And in these final days, I think he's kind of burnt out on the part he's got to play. Ultimately, I reject the notion, based on the evidence, based on his words, based on his actions, that Trump is fighting the system. Trump is cosplaying at fighting the system. Trump is LARPing at fighting the system. And by doing so, is manipulating his base into actually fighting the system. Turning them not into virtuous revolutionaries for the cause of the Christian nation, but getting them labeled as domestic terrorists. And isn't that funny how that somehow plays right into the very scary totalitarian, socialist, leftist police state fearmongering that is peddled by the right? Trump's own base is doing exactly what it would take to force the left to react in the kind of way that the right has been fear-mongering the left will behave in. The left is going to take all your guns away. Did they ever? Not really. They fought for stricter gun controls, for sure. And they encouraged the voluntary removal of firearms, quote, from the street. But they never rounded everybody up and forcibly took everyone's guns away. And guess what happened instead? Gun sales have exponentially grown in the last 5 years in ways unimaginable 10 years ago. It was actually a bit of a surprise to me on January 6th that there wasn't more gun violence. And now, with these ominous reports that the Trump base is organizing similar attacks on state capitol buildings on Inauguration Day, I cannot help but speak the following out loud. Donald Trump is complicit with the system, and the system wants you to choose violence, because then the system can respond with violence. All that fear-mongering about a police state coming out of the right, guess what? Your own leadership has manipulated you into being part of the cause for the implementation of a next-level police state. Just as much as the left was earlier in the year. Mind you, I will always defend anybody's right to protest. And I will always defend anybody's right to free speech. But I will always draw the hard line in the sand that protest and speech protected by the beloved Constitution that everyone's always jerking off to does not include violence and the verbal invocation and threatening of violence. Now, for many, that's a very soft, gray, and gradient line. Some even argue that free speech is such a broad right that it protects incitement to violence and threats of violence. But that's manipulative and misleading. Those of us willing to stand in opposition to Trump must remain compassionate and forgiving of his base. All those in the base that are involving themselves in these violent plots. January 6th was not the first, right? There was that group of MAGA guys that wanted to kidnap that governor and do who knows what to her. That's a tricky thing to ask of anybody, right? To stand united in strength with compassion and forgiveness against those who are openly rising up in hate and violence. But as I like to remind folks that are convinced that killing this person or killing that person will somehow magically solve the problem, it won't, because by doing so, you give in to the corruption that offended you about them in the first place. When we murder murderers for murdering others, we become murderers ourselves. Those of us who stand in opposition must be willing to remind our brothers and sisters who are being manipulated towards violence of these important realities. The violence will not solve the problems we create. 5,000 years worth of violence, and yet here we are, should be in a utopia of perfect society, because 5,000 years worth of violence should have solved all the problems. Categorically did not. Why? Because violence begets violence, it solves nothing, and it profits those who foment it. And no matter how you slice it, Trump has spent his entire time in public office two-facedly fomenting violence. And of course, condemning it. The very definition of hypocrisy. The very definition of being a two-faced politician. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Violence is bad, but go do some violence. As long as you do it in my name, it's fine. We are, I think, less than a week now, right? It's the 14th. Inauguration is on Wednesday the 20th. This show is about the intersection of spirituality and all those other things. So, dear friends, if you are a spiritual person, and I presume some of you must be, or else what the fuck are you listening to my show for? But if you are a spiritual person, regardless of which flavor, variety, school of thought, if you can set that divisive labeling system aside and focus on the true spiritual calling of our age, In my humble opinion, that calling right here and right now is to heal ourselves, heal each other, heal the species, and therefore heal the system of oppression. Don't take my blind faith, don't take me at my word just for blind faith's sake. Wow. Don't just blind faith believe in what I'm saying. But don't blindly reject it and dismiss it either. As always, friends, I humbly thank you for tuning in and inviting me into your brain with my words and crazy thoughts. As we move forward through time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart, and may you share that with your words, with your actions, and with your energies. The human species needs it. Until next time, I have been the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And this has been the 400th episode of the Almost Daily Zencast. Thank you for tuning in.
And that is the latest madness from behind the orange wall. Thank you for listening to GMT, a special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast. Stay woke, Trumptopia. Stay woke.
Only healing can transmute the darkness.